Good afternoon. I have a confession to make, which is I've always secretly wanted to be a superhero. And so I was really excited when Mike mentioned that faculty are superheroes, only to discover that instead of saving people's lives in our spare time, we get to go and do really exciting research projects. The good news about this, though, is that occasionally we do get to operate like superheroes. Every once in a while, as academics, we get to do detective work, and we're contacted by an organization that has a problem, and our job is try to solve it and get to the bottom of it. And I think my simultaneously favorite and least favorite example of this was about 7 years ago. I was contacted by the managers of a call center company. And they were running a call center that they were extremely upset about. They said they had a 400% annual turnover rate. So the entire staff would quit about every 2 months. If you can imagine the amount of time that you would spend hiring, recruiting, and retraining an entire staff 6 times a year, they obviously wanted to solve this problem. But even more pressing was the callers weren't working very hard while they were working in the jobs. And they wanted to motivate the callers and figure out, what do we do? How do we get these people to make more calls, spend more time on the phone, ultimately bring in more revenue for the organization? So I thought this was an interesting problem. And I went into the organization to try to get to the bottom of it. And I was really excited when I walked into the call center and I found that some callers were really trying to inspire each other through some of the signs that they would put up in front of their desks. And one of the signs I thought was so important, so memorable and so touching, that I actually stole it, scanned it, and I brought it here for you today. And I think it'll tell you a lot about the experience of being a call center employee for those of you who have never worked in this capacity. Here it is. Now, aside from leading you to question why some of us choose to wear dark suits, this also really gives you some insight into what goes on as a call center employee who brings in a lot of revenue and money for the organization and is really left in the dark about where that money goes and how it's used and how it makes a difference. So I went to the managers and I said, look, obviously there's a problem in terms of perceiving this work as meaningful, important. Is it really valued? What can we do about it? And the managers had read many of the guru-authored business books that adorn many of our shelves and said, well, a leader's fundamental job is to inspire. So what we're going to do is we're going to try to deliver some very inspiring messages about how important this work is. I thought this was an interesting idea. I thought it was something worth studying. So we designed a series of inspirational speeches. The managers came in. They talked about how important this work is, how it really made a difference. And callers' performance went down. Their effort went down, and basically every outcome we could track got worse. Now, one of the things that happens when you're a graduate student and a manager contacts you and asks you to help, and the solution you support actually causes harm, is you start to experience a little bit of an existential crisis, which begins with what is going on here and ends with how do I cover my bases and make sure that they don't fire me. So what I did was I tried to look at the literature on inspiration and figure out why might a leader's inspirational messages backfire. And I came across 3 answers. And I know that this is supposed to be a very practical talk for a lay audience, but I really wanted to bring to you the technical terms that I encountered so you can really sort of experience this in my shoes as the detective. So I really uncovered 3 different reasons why inspirational messages from a leader can backfire. The first one, again, in technical terms, is what we like to call the Napoleon Dynamite effect. Some leaders are very bad speakers. You might think of them as extremely introverted. We certainly saw this with one of our managers who walked in and said, I think it's very important that we all work very hard. And his voice started to trail to the point where only dogs could hear him. And it became very clear that this is not the kind of person with the charisma, the social skill, any of the grace that you would expect in a leader that would uplift your goals by the style of speech. But that's only one reason why a speaker might fail. A second factor might be the message. So there's a lot of evidence that when leaders try to deliver inspirational messages, they often end up focusing on themselves. And we certainly have all encountered narcissistic leaders who have that tendency, where they end up convincing you to work hard on their behalf as opposed to focusing your attention on the larger picture, the mission, and the vision, which is another reason why these can backfire. And then the third factor at play is the motives. So you can think about a bad speaker. You can think about a speaker who really fails to fully articulate the vision, the purpose behind your work. But you can imagine also that you've already covered those 2 bases. Think about a leader who's incredibly charismatic, who's a gifted speaker, and who actually is able to talk about why the organization's work is so important, not just why the leader is so important. What else might go wrong? you could imagine that a leader might have some ulterior motives. So if you're about to attend an inspirational speech, one of the things that you could imagine is you would be thinking, well, gee, my leader's trying to convince me this work is important. Why? So I'll work harder, bring in more revenue for the organization. And so there's a very clear reason that this leader wants me to be inspired. Can I really trust the message? Is it credible? And I always like to think of this as the Dwight Schrute effect. From the standpoint of no matter how charismatic, which is an open question, no matter how charismatic the speaker might be, no matter how compelling the message would be, you know that Dwight's goal is to get you to work harder. And so you find yourself skeptical and doubting that everything in the message is true and that you should really, really follow it. So I had gotten this evidence together, shared it with the managers some of the studies, and started wondering, is there another source of these inspiring messages that might be compelling? What would happen if it wasn't the leader who actually told these stories, but if we found someone else who could communicate why this work was important and why it was worth doing? Could we bring that person in as a more neutral source? And we actually gave that a try. It was a bit of a challenge. We only had 5 minutes. The managers obviously wanted to keep the callers motivated, and they said, look, we don't want to take them off the phones for very long. We'll give you 5 minutes. Whatever you want to do in that 5-minute realm to motivate these callers is fine. So I started thinking a little bit about, well, who could articulate the purpose and the meaning behind this work? And I asked a really simple question, which is, who benefits from this work? Where does the money that the callers bring in go? And the answer I got, this happened to be a call center at a university, was actually the money goes to help scholarship students. And so the more money that you raise as a caller, the more students, particularly underprivileged students, can actually attend school at this university. Now, I can't say too much more about the context because of confidentiality, but it is fair to say that this research was done at a large public university. Their mascot rhymes with the Wolverines. This was a setting where when we got our data, it turned out that more than half of all total dollars raised actually were channeled directly to student scholarships. So what would happen if we brought in the scholarship students to actually tell their stories and say, here's how I got my scholarship. It was funded by the work that you all did as callers. Here's how it's really made a difference in my life. And communicate that this work is important and that there are other people out there depending on it, just like these scholarship students. So I really thought about this as outsourcing inspiration to the end beneficiaries or recipients, or you can think about them as end users of the work. It might be a customer, might be a client, might be a patient. And the advantage here is they're neutral. These scholarship recipients already have their scholarship. They don't necessarily have an ulterior motive to get the callers to work harder. They can also speak from their firsthand experience of actually having benefited from the work in a meaningful way that the managers and leaders perhaps can't. And what they can do is really convince the callers that the work makes an impact, that it's appreciated and valued, that there are other people out there really depending on them, and potentially also learn something from these speeches about where the money they raise is going, that they could communicate as callers to the alums that they were speaking with. So I designed a very simple intervention. A scholarship student comes in. He talks about how he got his scholarship, how it made his difference in his life. And then there's several control groups of callers. I'll show you one today who don't actually get to hear this from the scholarship student. In some cases, they get to hear the same exact message from the leader. In other cases, they just go about their work as usual. And lo and behold, we get these remarkable effects where when you hear from that one scholarship student for 5 minutes, you nearly triple in the amount of time you spend on the phone per week. But the callers in the control group or who hear that same message from the leader show no statistically significant increase in the amount of time they're spending on the phone. But you might think, well, these callers are just spinning their wheels. They feel a little bit guilty. So they're keeping poor alums on the phone longer, trying to get them to not hang up. One way you could get at that is to ask, well, how many calls are they actually making? Are they working harder? Are they reaching more people? And in another analysis, we find when you hear from that one scholarship student, the average caller more than doubles in the amount of calls made per hour. And OK, great, they're working harder. Are they actually inspired to perform better? Are they raising more money? The answer appears to be a pretty clear yes. The average caller in one of my studies actually nearly shows a 500% increase in week-long intervals in money raised from before versus after that scholarship student. So the typical caller would go from raising about $400 a week to over $2,000 a week. If you look at this blue line here, that's 23 callers raising about $38,000 extra dollars per week because of one 5-minute visit from an end user. So I think this has some really exciting implications for leaders. It means a couple things. One is that leaders are not always the best sources of inspirational messages. You might think that your responsibility as a leader or a manager is to really set the vision and convince people of the importance and impact of their work. But there are all sorts of end users, whether they're clients, customers, or patients, who benefit from the work and who might actually be better sources of these messages. And so what I really think about as the leader's role in terms of inspiration is not just delivering the message, but actually establishing the connection, serving as a bit of a linking pin to figure out who are these end users who have really benefited from the work in a meaningful way, and how do we get their messages in front of the callers. A couple examples of organizations that are doing this in creative ways. Medtronic, medical technology company, has an annual party. They invite 6 patients every year to tell their stories about how Medtronic's work has either changed or saved their lives. Former CEO Bill George says that every single one of Medtronic's 30,000 plus employees has a defining moment where they come face to face with a patient whose life has been changed by their work, and they walk away with a renewed sense of purpose that would really be hard to emulate if it's a leader talking about the exact same thing. John Deere, other side of the spectrum, actually has an initiative where when farmers buy tractors that are going to help support their families, they get to come in and meet with and thank the engineers and the manufacturing employees who have worked on the tractors, establishing that connection, letting them see the impact of their work. Sometimes it's really hard to bring in your end users directly. There are a lot of organizations that make good use of stories. Volvo has a Volvo Save My Life Club, where if you're ever told by an emergency medical technician, a physician, a police officer, that a Volvo car made the difference between life and death for you, Volvo actually collects these stories and is able to share them with engineers and various employees across the organization to remind them about how much their safety practices really make a difference. Wells Fargo has another practice that works in similar ways, giving low-interest loans to help people afford houses and mortgages. And there are some managers at Wells Fargo who actually go around and videotape their customers and clients talking about this work, about how these loans have really changed their lives, and communicating those to the loan officers as a way of really inspiring them. And sometimes there's research evidence showing that even a photo of an end user can make a difference. A great study out of Israel, radiologists who typically have no patient contact are asked to look at an X-ray. And they're supposed to evaluate, are there any health risks in the X-ray? And half of the radiologists are given a photo of that patient along with the X-ray. The other half of the radiologists see no photo. And as you might expect, seeing the photo humanizes the patient, reminds you that your work has these important consequences. The radiologists actually feel more empathy for the patients, they spend more time on diagnoses, and they achieve more accuracy as a result. But here's what's interesting. You go back to these same radiologists 6 months later, and now you switch their conditions. So the radiologists have forgotten that they ever made these diagnoses in the first place. They don't remember the specific scan. And now the ones who had the photo have it taken away. The ones who didn't have the photo have it added, and their performance switches. And so having the photo is enough to drive you to work harder and more effectively on behalf of these patients, again, simply by reminding you of the consequences. So I think this is a really exciting opportunity for leaders to think about who are the best sources of my inspirational messages. Is it me? Sometimes, sure. But are there clients, are there customers, are there patients? Are there end users who can communicate how this work is meaningful to employees in a way that perhaps I can't? But I also think this has really exciting implications for us in the classroom. And imagine yourself as a professor on the first day, trying to convince students that they need your finance material, that they need to learn the management principles that we cover, that marketing is critical. Are you the most credible source of that message as a professor? Despite my current occupation, I would say no, because I obviously have a vested interest in believing that management is important. So what would happen if I actually brought in a former student or a series of former students to talk about how they'd use the knowledge that was conveyed in my class, and ideally that knowledge was beneficial to them in some way? Now granted, all of us can't bring in former students like this one, who could say basically, this was me before Wharton, and this was me after. But I think we do have the opportunity as faculty to think about who are the students whose careers and lives have been affected by our work. And can we illustrate the importance of the class material that we teach through these students as a different source? I think in addition to opening students' minds to learning, this might actually help to reinvigorate and inspire all of us as professors by reminding us how our jobs make a difference. Thank you all so much.